For this episode, I wanted to talk about someone that is deeply important to me, and I don't think my generation of millennials adequately appreciates him. I want to talk about the genius of Bob Newhart. I would guess that most people my age and younger know Bob Newhart as Professor Proton in The Big Bang Theory, or he might always be Bernard from The Rescuers Down Under to you. But I was one of those 20 somethings who actively got excited when he first appeared on Big Bang Theory because he was already a hero to me. He was actually number one on my list of celebrities that I wanted to meet. And now I can't. If I could pick someone to play in a biopic, I would want to be Bob Newhart or Bill Watterson. And I think I'd have a better chance of Bob. The first stand-up routine that I ever saw was Stephen Wright on a Betamax that my parents taped it on before I was even born. But the first stand-up routine that I ever heard was Bob Newhart's tobacco bit. My dad found it on Seth Green's app, and he and I started hunting down other Bob Newhart bits after that. I shared them with my best friend at the time, and he also joined in the search for more Bob Newhart. I still remember the first time that I heard Driving Instructor to this day, and it is still one of the funniest routines that I have ever heard. From there, it was a short trip to the Bob Newhart show, and what a joy that discovery was. It's absolutely hilarious and one of the great sitcoms of all time. My wife likes to say of herself that she collects hobbies. I collect interests. When I get into a topic, I learn a lot about it for a little while, and then I move on to something else. And Bob Newhart was one of those things. And when I went through my Bob Newhart phrase, I came to believe that while my generation and the next probably don't really know him, he is one of the most important comedians of the 20th century. He was a singular pioneer that blazed a trail for current generations. Now, Bob Newhart did not push the boundaries of comedy. He was not a Richard Pryor or George Carlin that left a clear before and after his comedy. No, his influence was less on the world of stand up than it was comedians themselves. That's not to say that his comedy wasn't brilliant, because it absolutely was. His fantastic autobiography, aptly titled I Shouldn't Even Be Doing This, had a quote from Jerry Seinfeld saying, "Every comedian I know wishes that they were as good as Bob Newhart." Anytime someone in a medium is particularly good, it pushes those around them to be better. But Newhart's comedy was strange and almost inimitable. Anyone would immediately know a comedian was copying him simply by the jokes that they told. For the uninitiated, and I recommend that you remedy that as soon as possible, his routine was one sided conversations in weird situations. A submarine captain talking to his crew, a police chief talking to a cop on the beat, a driving instructor, Abe Lincoln's publicist, all kinds of stuff. The odd trick that he employed is that if it was a real conversation bit, a two-person act like Abbott and Costello, Bob would be the straight man, the normal guy dealing with a crazy situation. And this created the comedic version of the shark in Jaws. The audience's imagination and had to come up with what the other person was doing, and what they thought of was probably funnier than what Bob would have thought of. And he gave enough information for the audience to follow the conversation, but the exact wording, actions, and voice of the other person was left up to you. That is just an analysis of what he did, though. It's not what made him so influential. I need to tell you the story of how he started. Bob was working in an office when he made a friend. Their job was incredibly boring, and to amuse each other, they started making up these one sided conversations. Both men thought that they were very funny. So his friend suggested they record some of their little things and maybe send them to local radio stations. After a while, the friend moved away, but Bob was having fun. So he kept recording things and kept sending them into radio stations. And I need to point out at this point that Bob was already 30. He didn't start this during or shortly after college. This was just a hobby that amused him while he was expecting to work in an office until retirement. Eventually, a local DJ got a hold of the recordings and he really liked them. He played a couple on his show and they were not unpopular. At that time, Bob thought, people kind of enjoy these. Maybe I should try doing them in front of people. So he performed a couple of sketches at a few small comedy clubs around Chicago, and they were, at the time, well received. Meanwhile, this DJ, who really liked the recordings, got Bob a meeting with Warner Brothers Records. The two of them attended the meeting with Bob's recordings, and the executive listened to them and loved them so much that he signed Bob to a record deal on the spot. And then they flew him out to Dallas to record some of the best bits in front of a small audience so that they could put it together on an album, The Button Down Mind of Bob Newhart. To say that album was a success would be a colossal understatement. It was certified gold, and I'm just going to quote Billboard's website for a second. It was the first comedy album to ever reach number one, and it stayed there longer than any other comedy album in history. 14 weeks. It was the first live album to ever reach number one. It was Warner Brothers' first number one, and I'm still going. The album was so popular that Warner Brothers only weeks later recorded more of Bob on a second album, and Bob Newhart became the second comedian to reach the number one spot in the same year. But before his second album overtook his first album, he was the first person to ever have his first album be at number one while his second album was number two. To this day, only Guns N' Roses have achieved that, and they kind of cheated by making their first album a double release. According to Billboard, only 10 artists in history have had number one and two at the same time. I'm still going. His first album became the first comedy album to win the Grammy for Album of the Year. Not spoken word album. Don't get me wrong, he did win Best Spoken Word Album too, but that was for his second album on the same night. But he didn't leave the Grammys with 2 trophies. No, he left with 3 because he is also the first and only comedian to ever win Best New Artist. One last thing, the release of his first album occurred less than a year after he started recording his sketches. This was the most pioneering of Bob Newhart's achievements. Think about what he did. He recorded funny sketches in his home and sent them out into the world where they exploded in popularity. In 1960, Bob Newhart was essentially the first viral YouTube comedian. Yes, it was different, but it was also the same. At this point, as you might expect, his career absolutely exploded. He did television appearances on sketch shows, and he was one of Johnny Carson's favorite guests. So much so that he would call up Bob Newhart for last-minute slots, including one time that a Winter Olympic long jumper had to cancel, so Bob filled his slot, but Johnny didn't change any of the scripted questions, leaving Bob to improvise answers on a topic that he knew absolutely nothing about. He and Johnny Carson were actually really good friends for all of Johnny Carson's life. Eventually, he found his way to where most comedians did in the 60s, a nightly show in Las Vegas. And weirdly, this step that everyone else took led him to doing something that no one else had before. 3 years after the release of his first album, Bob got married. So now he was living in Vegas, married, with a gaggle of kids. And being a Vegas comic was becoming a strain on him because he really liked being a dad. But his days consisted of his kids being at school all day and then him getting ready to go to work when they got home. He was missing them. But providentially, he then had a conversation with Mary Tyler Moore about her job. Working on a sitcom was the dream for a performer with a family. It's technically a steady job with normal 9 to 5 hours. He was sold on the idea. He came out with the idea for the Bob Newhart Show, and it was off to the races for his very successful sitcom. To my knowledge, this was the first time that a stand-up comic had ever started and starred in a sitcom based around his comedic style. And that just started a grand tradition that we're only just now not in anymore. Not because comedians don't want to do it, just because we've stopped making sitcoms. This also led him to becoming an accidental pioneer when his show spawned the first television drinking game.
Hey, Bob. Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob. Happy birthday.
That's too many. He later had a second successful sitcom, which is to this day just about unheard of, and it contained what is considered to be the greatest ending in sitcom history. However, we can't credit Bob for that because it was actually his wife's idea. But he had one last thing to be first on. In 1977, he voiced Bernard in The Rescuers, and he became the first male celebrity to voice an animated Disney film. He was not the first celebrity, period, because his co star Ava Gabor beat him to it with the Aristocats. But at the time, he was the most successful celebrity to do a Disney voiceover role. And now that's the norm. You may not like that that's the norm, but without Bob, we may not have had Robin Williams as Genie, or Tom Hanks as Woody, or Tim Allen as Buzz, or Jeremy Irons as Scar. So we owe a lot to Bob. His star power waned after that second sitcom, but he never really went away. According to IMDb, he appeared in 45 movies and TV shows, as well as appearing as himself in over 100 different shows. When the trailer dropped for Elf, all of my friends were excited to see Will Ferrell in a movie. And I was excited about Bob Newhart. There was one personal way that Bob influenced me, and that was with something that we had in common. We both have a stammer. A stammer is different than a stutter. A stutter is when you get stuck on a syllable, and a stammer gets you stuck on a word or words. I don't actually know what causes a stutter, but a stammer happens, and I swear this isn't a brag, because your brain is moving faster than your mouth. I've got it pretty under control now, but when I was a kid, I would tell my mom I saw a dog walking down the street and he saw a white cat and chased it up a tree. But while my mouth was saying dog walking, my brain was all ready to chased it. And this would cause a short in my mouth. And what people would hear was, I saw a dog, a dog, I saw a dog, I saw a dog walking, a dog walking, I saw a dog walking, and is very annoying. The way that you deal with a kid with a stammer is tell him to stop and start over, and this was incredibly frustrating because I'm pretty sure that people with a stutter know that they're stuttering. A stammer, your brain isn't thinking about your mouth at all, so you actually have no idea that it's happening. I had no idea why my mom was asking me to start over all the time, and it drove me nuts. You can usually spot somebody with a stammer because they'll repeat words or parts of words unnecessarily. You think Jeff Goldblum and basically everything after Jurassic Park. Bob having a stammer didn't matter to me in an I feel seen way. What it did was teach me how to use it in a performance or to be funny. Someone once asked Bob if his stammer was real or faked, and he answered, "What stammer?" In this video, I would be remiss if I don't give some information about Bob as a person. Bob was faithfully married to his wife for over 60 years, and there was never a rumor about infidelity. He had 4 kids who all actually seemed to be sane, like they had good parents. One of them is something normal like a real estate attorney. And he has a bunch of grandkids and a bunch of great grandkids. Not as many as my grandma, but a lot nonetheless. He was also a true gentleman. There were nothing but kind words said about him when he passed last year. He was funny, kind, loving, humble, and really just an all around great person. And I cannot stress this enough. He was a professional comedian for 64 years, and there are no scandals attached to his name. Not so much as a he was too flirty one time. His Big Bang Theory co-stars, probably the youngest group to work with him and the most likely to be overly politically correct about him, all had nothing but kind words to say about how sweet he was and how he was still just as funny as he had ever been. Near the end of his life, he gave an interview where he was asked if he would ever retire, and he quipped that he doesn't know what that means for a comedian. He still thinks of funny stuff and writes it down and thinks, I've still got it. If you haven't experienced the joy Bob brought to the world, look into it. Start with The Button Down Mind of Bob Newhart. I don't think it's on Spotify right now, but it's got to be findable somewhere. And from there, move on to the Bob Newhart show and Newhart. And that one was spelled Newhart for some reason. I don't know. Watch The Rescuers and The Rescuers Down Under again while you're at it if you haven't in a while. Bob Newhart was a great man, and I would hate for him to be forgotten. So help his memory live on. Reportedly, he was a devout Catholic, so if he's in heaven, I really hope that God greeted him by saying, "Hi, Bob. You'll see me next time if you subscribe. Bye."
You remind me a lot, and this is the highest compliment I can pay any stand-up or any comedian is you remind me a lot of Bob Newhart.